Hi again, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to look at consecutive interpretation and interpretation in the courtroom more closer now. Laws and politics. Consecutive interpretation, as you can hopefully remember, is shortly CI. When the interpreter takes notes while listening to a speech, then does his or her interpretation during pauses. This is commonly used when there are just two languages at work. For example, if the American and French presidents, wow, think about the situation, and think about the responsibility as well, were having a discussion. The consecutive interpreter would interpret in both directions. Here is Obama, here is Hollande, I think that's the new one now, and you're in the middle. I mean, language-wise, maybe not physically. French to English and English to French, going back and forth. Unlike translation and simultaneous interpretation, consecutive interpretation is commonly done into the interpreter's source and target languages. As you remember, the simultaneous one, you hear and say from source to target, so you don't have time to go back and you don't have the need to go back. But here it's going back and forth. Here we prepared some accessible sources for you, and you can look, you can click on them and look more for details. Meanwhile, I'm going to go through the reading material with you, with adding some of my important points I'd like to share with you. Interpretation in the courtroom. Now that's a responsibility. I can't say it enough that medical and legal translation and interpretation are crucial because human lives are depending on them. So please be aware of the importance of that area. We can study the interpretation procedures and through a handbook for Ohio judges. This is just an example for you. Interpreters in the judicial system open to the public. So you can download the link, click on it. Here is a sample of procedures we put together for you. Let's look at it together, but please, I encourage you, afterwards you go to that link and find further information. A judge should presume a need for an interpreter. Now we're going to look at this first. How do I know if a party or witness needs an interpreter? How to determine the need of one? When an attorney or proce litigant indicates a party or a witness requests an interpreter. If a request for an interpreter is not made, but it appears a party or a witness has limited English proficiency, a judge should ask the following questions on the record to determine if an interpreter is necessary. I hope you are familiar with the word, with the phrase on the record, off the record. So I will say on the record, which means it should be recorded, it should be proven that these questions have been asked. Determining the English proficiency of a party and the need for an interpreter. In general, we avoid the questions for that, which are just yes or no, because yes or no doesn't give any idea of how well you speak. For example, they might ask the person, please tell the court your name. I think everybody might understand the word name. How did you learn English? They mostly probably expect you or the person to talk in full sentences, not like, Allison, at school. When something like that comes, then that person might need somebody. Or, please tell me about your country. Romania, beautiful, is probably not the answer. Tell me more about your country. Mountains, probably not like that. So the person should be able to at least build 2 or 3 sentences, or maybe sentences with a clause in it preferably, to kind of convince the judge, the jury, and the court that he or she is proficient in this language. And or, what is the highest grade you completed in school? elementary school diploma would probably be enough if the language is there, by the way. But at least you understood the questions and answer. Describe some of the things you see in this courtroom. Although it looks very easy, it's not. Because, ladies and gentlemen, specifically when there is a crime scene, can happen. We are in the courtroom. It is so important, the language of description. How something happened, where something happened, all the WH questions we call in English grammar. Where exactly was it? From which ankle did it? All these things, description English is very important if we are dealing with a crime scene. You have the right to a court-appointed interpreter. That's for the people there. Tell the court the best way to communicate with you and to let you know what is being said. This information is for those who need an interpreter for sure. Before they actually figure it out by asking you some questions, a person, if you are the person and not the interpreter, don't mix up the yous here. We are talking about the people who might be needing interpreters. They can also express that themselves. How do I know, or how does the jury or the court or the judge know that the interpreter is qualified? Oh, by the way, there is a little star, as you can see. Let's read it together. Currently, Ohio law, that can be different from country to country, from county to county. This is just an example. Ohio law does not require interpreters to be certified. However, interpreters must be qualified under EVID.R.604. Go figure. This is just an example. A certified interpreter should be used. If one is not available, a candidate must have a relevant training, specialized skills and knowledge, including familiarity with legal terminology, slang even, idioms, and dialectical variations, different dialects. Candidates must also know the modes of interpretation, like will it be simultaneous, consecutive, or and side translation? Can you remember what they were? I hope so. Being bilingual, that's very important. Being bilingual does not qualify a person to interpret children. Relatives and friends should never be used to interpret. Judges, attorneys, and court personnel should not function as interpreters. I'm 100% sure that you understood these sentences, but could you also guess why? Because there is a huge ethical thing laying underneath. Because, first of all, being bilingual does not qualify a person to interpret. You got it, because we are always talking how knowledgeable you have to be, how aware you have to be about that law language or legal language. But why do you think children, relatives, or friends should never be used to interpret? Because they cannot be objective in translating. Very simple. Also, judges, attorneys, and court personnel, they can be too professionally biased. So it must be somebody who is totally neutral, just focusing on language, not about the outcome. Now look at this. Actually, this material really excited me a lot. Look, a sample voir dire to determine interpreter qualifications. Stop any French in a Parisian street and ask, unless he or she is dealing with the law or court, ask what voir dire is. He or she will suddenly say, wait a minute, un moment, voir means seeing, and dire means saying, so seeing and saying. But better said, saying what you are seeing. Not at all. Because voir dire is a legal term or a phrase which is based on very, very old Latin language. And this voir comes from veritas, which is truth, not voir like regarder, seeing. Although it does still make sense, but because when you see and then say what you see, that is probably also connected to the truth. But basically this means like tell the truth. Having said that, let's look what is the qualification here, or what are they? What training or credentials do you have as an interpreter? That you can be asked. What is your native language? Again, please answer in sentences and not words, like the person. Are you familiar with the National Association for Judiciary Interpreters and Translators Code of Ethics and Professional Responsibility? You should say yes, and you should know it. What are its main points? Better have it ready in your head already. How many times have you interpreted in court? Please be honest, whatever happens. Describe your familiarity with legal terminology. You can say intermediate, like language level, or I think I have enough knowledge. What types of cases have you interpreted? If you have a former experience, feel free to add it as it is. Are you related to or close friends with anyone in this case? Hopefully not. Otherwise, you shouldn't be occupied with there. Do you understand you are to be a neutral party who is here to facilitate communication, and that you should not offer advice or interject your opinion into these proceedings? Ladies and gentlemen, especially in legal translation, but generally in interpreting at all, you are a person with a knowledge of vocabulary, without any opinion, without any connection to the issue, almost like an overly smart robot. You should really, like an android, without putting your emotions into it, without taking part in any of the case or situation, just think linguistically and give it away. That's very important here specifically. For sure, if you translate a soccer match in a TV, we're going to come to that, you might unfortunately put your emotions, and nobody will actually jail you for that or penalize you for that. Even there, if you are a translator, keep your emotions inside, whatever you're translating, specifically in medical and legal translations. Okay, so these questions have been answered. So when satisfied with the interpreter's qualifications, the oath may be given. Interpreter oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm you will interpret accurately, completely, and impartially, using your best skill and judgment in accordance with the standards prescribed by law, and follow all official guidelines established by this court for legal interpreting or translating, and discharge all of the solemn duties and obligations of legal interpretation and translation? As you see, this question is almost as committed or important as, do you take this woman for life, and will you ever support her until the death you part? So it's almost like a marriage with the work. You have to be committed because, as I told you, like lives might depend on them. How can I facilitate communication in an interpreted proceeding? So this is now the task of the court. Advise everyone in the courtroom of the presence and the role of the interpreter, so they should know about you. Instruct all participants to speak loudly and clearly, and allow only one person to speak at a time. See, these are the measures which might ease your work, and that's now their responsibility. But it's good, and you have to know it. It's good to know. Allow the interpreter, you, converse briefly with the non-English speaker to ensure understanding of accents, dialect, or pronunciation differences. That can happen even in your mother tongue. You might be coming from northern Germany and were not probably familiar with the Bayerisch, which is a southern German accent or dialect, better said, or somebody might be coming from Okinawa, and you're a Tokyoer. So what you're going to say, can you understand his or her language or dialect? It can happen. So we will tell you how to approach the person you will be translating or interpreting in later pages. So it's important, this little conversation. As the non-English speaker, if the speaker is able to understand, and communicate through the interpreter. Instruct the speaker to interrupt or raise a hand if the speaker doesn't understand something. So this is, again, the job of the court, to warn or encourage the speaker to stop the translation the moment he or she doesn't get it. Allow the interpreter to view court files. You have to look at them prior to the proceedings to become familiar with names, parties, and technical vocabulary. Speak directly to the party or witness, not to the interpreter. We'll give you the wrongs and the rights soon, so it's very important. As I told you, you are the very sensitive, flexible, linguistically upperly equipped robot there. So it's not that you is what the judge or any of the jurors are talking to. It's the person. You are just transposing it. So he even shouldn't forget it, not or she, not only you. Because that can also confuse the interpreter when suddenly a judge turns, which it never happened, and asks you something. You feel like, oh God, it's not me. Certainly it's not you, and they won't do it. This is just a little reminder for them. And always direct the interpreter to interpret in the first person. Now we are coming to there. In order for the record to be accurate. Because if the speaker talks like, I have not been there that day, and you turn to the judge or the lawyer and say, she was not there that day, first of all, that looks like an opinion or sounds like an opinion, which is not correct. I mean, you cannot have an opinion about it. You cannot tell whether she was there or not. You don't know it. You just have to translate here person by person as if you are that person who speaks in the target language. I have not been there in French or Swedish. Okay, the interpreter must convey all questions, answers, and courtroom dialogue. Therefore, the interpreter is constantly working. Can you understand how much you should be focused on every single minute, every single second? Okay, advise the interpreter to notify the court when breaks are needed. One has bladders or coughing issues, you never know. If the proceeding will last longer than 2 hours, require the presence of 2 interpreters who can switch off as needed. We are humans. I said robot, but I know that you're not one. Recognize that court proceedings can be confusing and intimidating for a non-English speaker, since other countries' legal systems and concepts often vary from those of United States. So this is again the task of the court, to make that person who has to be in the court know that the proceedings in this country are or can be very different from the ones he or she is used to. Okay, now we are here with the roles of the interpreters in the justice system. This is your role now. Open your ears and eyes. I'm coming. A working group examined the role and the use of interpreters in the justice system, and the findings included, now we are approaching it, helping lawyers identify qualified interpreters, identifying the existing accreditation schemes or schemes, identifying current policies and practices with regard to interpreters in the justice system, including examining any limitations and gaps in service. Can you understand how much knowledgeable you really have to be? It's worth. Educating all stakeholders in the justice system on the proper role of interpreters and how to work effectively with them. Now, woman, now you can't say, Leila, this is not my job. I'm going to just interpret. Still, you should know. You should know their rights so that you can understand yours. And establishing a conduit with other groups interested in ensuring quality legal interpretation. Exploring the possibility of having interpreters declared officers of the court. in page 23 of the handbook we were talking about, you can actually find more descriptions of these roles as an interpreter. But here we took some of them to discuss with you. Look, the role of the interpreter in legal proceedings, the role, now I'm giving you some examples here. The role of the interpreter is to place the limited English proficient, shortly called LEP, deaf or hard of hearing individual in a position as close as linguistically possible to that of a similarly situated English speaker. Which means you will actually represent this person's sayings, not the person himself or herself, as if he were a proficient English speaker. When somebody hears you, such a juror or judge, that somebody would almost think that he is actually listening to him or her through you. So that's very important if you understand that. To this end, the interpreter must interpret completely and accurately, adding or omitting nothing, giving due consideration to grammar, syntax, intent, register, and level of language of the original speaker. Yes, you are actually the filter of the brain and the tongue of that person, translating and transmitting everything in the target language. So they should, hearing you, they should be feeling that they're hearing him or her speaking. The interpreter should not interpret word by word or word for word, but should render what may be termed the closest natural equivalent, the closest of the source message into English. Having an interpreter should not result in an advantage or disadvantage to the limited English proficient person, deaf or hard of hearing witness or defendant, which means it's just the language being transferred that should not actually provide the person with an advantage. Like, why am I saying that? Because you might, if you have an emotional attachment to the case or to the person, which you shouldn't have, you are smart. You can have such an intonation, very hidden in your interpretation, that might affect the jury even more than when he or she would have said it in his language or her language. You can do it. You shouldn't do it. So that's exactly what you have to actually avoid. As imperial officers of the court, interpreters, transliterators, and translators act strictly in the interest of the court, not the person, not the jury, not the judge. The court. Their duty is to the judicial process rather than to any particular party or person involved in the case. The role of the interpreters should be made clear to the parties and attorneys at the commencement of proceedings in order to avoid distracting explanations at a later time, which might interrupt the flow of proceedings. Which means if you don't act accordingly, that will delay the case, because that will kind of create a distraction. Now, we were talking about like you not saying he or she to the speaker. That's exactly what it is, what you have to actually get used to. Direct speech in legal settings. To ensure a clear and unambiguous record, the interpreter and all other speakers in the courtroom, judges, parties, attorneys, witnesses, court personnel, the relatives, whoever have to speak, must employ what is called direct speech. Direct speech means that everyone should direct everything they say to each other, exactly as they would if there were no language or hearing issue. The interpreter interprets and speaks or signs, we talked about that as well, the speaker's message in the other language, but says or signs it in the first person, because the speaker talks in the first person. When the speaker said he, then you translate he for sure. But as long as the speaker uses I, the first pronoun, you have to go with first. And yes, you can also see the table 5.1. We give you the sources here as well. You can definitely refer to in the handbook. But let's continue with the examples. Direct speech in open court ensures everyone in the courtroom always hears the speaker's first person words, which the court reporter can record in English, either as spoken by the original speaker or by the interpreter. This rule also applies to the interpreted conversations between attorney and client that are not on the record, because the principles of avoiding confusion and unobstructed accuracy are the same. So everything should be, you have to really think that you are in a live show, CNN or where everybody is watching you. Everybody's watching everybody, because you have to be all clear, transparent, and correct. All of you in the courtroom. Direct speech preserves the integrity and plea of agreements, of plea and agreements pursuant to CRIM, right? 11, you go there. Avoids miscommunication, reduces confusion and resultant delays, minimizes the adverse effect of presence of an interpreter might have on interactions among the various persons in the courtroom, promotes quality, and also it explains why and how with more examples if you want to look at that. I will actually attract your attention to this chart here, to this beautiful comparisons. What can be right, what can be wrong. For example, judge is saying, please state your name for the record. Judge would never actually turn to you and say, please ask him to state his name off the record. No, that's wrong. Judge knows that. You should know that too. Okay, a trained interpreter would say, please state your name for the record. You don't turn to the person and say, the judge is asking you about your name, because you are not actually transmitting, or you are not the in-between person. You are not his friend. You are not the judge's assistant. You are the translator, interpreter, better said. So you have to use exact language and the pronoun the judge is saying. And then when speaking in the third person is okay, appropriate. Let's look at that one. So we learned that if somebody speaks in the I form or me, all kinds of subject and object pronouns, you have to exactly translate those pronouns and not go into the third form. But there could be certain circumstances you can maybe say she or he. Let's look. Proper third-person self-reference by interpreters eliminates possible ambiguities and helps to maintain the clarity of the record. When interpreters need to speak directly to the judge on their own behalf, rather than interpreting the words of someone else, they should always refer to themselves in the third person. What do I mean by that? Let's look. For example, a trained interpreter would say, Your Honor, the interpreter requests a repetition. The interpreter did not hear the question. Instead of saying, excuse me, but I didn't get it. Or, I didn't hear the questions. Can we stop here for a while? You don't say that. So talk about yourself as the third person, because you are even interpreting yourself. This interpreting here means like expressing. So you look even at yourself as a different person there. You don't have your own I in a courtroom. Yeah? Either you are the he or she, who is the interpreter, or you are, when you say I, it belongs to the speaker. Is it clear or is it very confusing? Okay, we're going to go into that in every module a little bit, but that's for now. I don't want to confuse and bore you too much with that. Let's look at further. Because interpreters are officers of the court, it is important they conduct themselves in a professional manner. Now we are talking about the ethical duties at all times and observe the canons of the Code of Ethics, which require them to. Let's see what you should do for the ethics. Render complete and accurate interpretation. Kind of given. Avoid any conflict of interest, financial or otherwise. This protects you too. Represent their credentials accurately and completely. You don't lie about your background or achievements. Report any ethical violation, action, or information that suggests imminent harm to anyone, relates to a criminal act, God forbid, or efforts by a party to induce the interpreter to violate a law, oh my God, or refrain from dispensing legal advice, which means don't give legal advice, you're just translating there. Communicating conclusions or expressing personal opinions, not at all, to those for whom they are interpreting. Refrain from providing services to the court if he or she has a stake in the outcome. So you should really be detached from the whole thing. That's basically it. Refrain from providing services in which he or she has served as an interpreter in preparation of litigation. So even to prepare your task or duty as a law court or courtroom interpreter, you see how much you have to be reading, how much you have to know, and how much you have to research. And please do so. Other interpreter requirements, it's not enough yet, they all want more. The interpreter should interpret everything said in the courtroom. Have you ever watched a courtroom? Maybe you did. Maybe you saw some of the cases on television that there is also a courtroom painter. I always wanted to know why they are doing this. Why don't they take photos instead? Yeah, because of any misinterpretation they are afraid of. So as much as they paint every single look, every single gesture, if the person does that, you know, almost like an illustrator, like scene by scene, that's what you have to do, and that's what the recordings might show. Every single second in the courtroom should be actually an evidence for the whole case. Yeah, and the interpreter should be as unobtrusive and professional as possible. If the interpreter does not understand a phrase or a word, he or she should immediately request clarification from the court and parties. How? By saying the interpreter, not I. Don't forget it. When requesting clarification, it always should be made clear that the interpreter is speaking on his or her own behalf and not interpreting for the party or witness. Ladies and gentlemen, there's one other thing I want to share with you. Did you realize why you shouldn't say I when you talk about yourself? Guess. When you give the right answer and call us la 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 la, I'll give you a reward. No, I'm just joking. But it's very easy to guess because, remember, the interpreter always interprets the speaker when he or she, the interpreter, says I. So the judge is not only that you should be involved as I, the whole thing. When the judge hears you saying something in I, his ear automatically thinks that the speaker says that. But when you say the interpreter requires more clarification, the judge understands that you require it, not the speaker. So that's also, it's not only that you shouldn't be involved personally, but also you should ease the job of the judge to understand who needs what. I hope I'm clear with that. Last but not least, a couple of lines when you can bear with me. An interpreter never should carry on independent conversations with the party or witness for whom he or she is interpreting. Please pay attention to that, because when we later on deal with the media and arts or TV interpretations or translations, it's the opposite. There, you have to know the person beforehand. Maybe have a little conversation beforehand. Here, never. You should be like ice cold, totally impartial, having no bond, no anything exchanging, nothing. And except for a brief conversation with the court's permission prior to the commencement of testimony. In the case of a foreign language interpreter, the sole purpose of this conversation is to establish that the interpreter can understand and make himself or herself understood by that LEP person. And in the case of a sign language interpreter, to establish the deaf or hard of hearing person's preferred mode of communication. So that it's kind of like a microphone check, basically, nothing else. Like how we check the microphone and then look, okay, everything is working. That's exactly what it is required for, nothing more than that. Are you a little bit into it now? I guess so. See you next time.